Before we get going, I just wanted to say it occurred to me as I was preparing for this today that my book came out 2 years ago, or almost 2 years ago now, and Joseph's has come out 2 weeks ago, and we're sort of the latest in a long line of literary people among either Indigenous people or Wampanoag people. I don't know if a lot of folks know that. There doesn't seem to be that awareness, and that is something that has happened, for the last 400 years. In the 17th century, Wampanoag people learned to read and write, and they were writing in the Wampanoag language. They translated the Bible. There were deeds, letters, petitions, many sorts of documents that are recorded in the Wampanoag language, and that's how our Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project got founded, was with the use of those documents. And by the 19th century, people were actually writing books, and it just continued into the 20th century. And I look on Amazon a lot, and I see more and more and more Indigenous authors in general, just writing about their cultures or our culture. And, an Indigenous perspective is so very different from non-Indigenous that you get almost a completely different way of seeing things, which is, what we're hoping to do, with our books here today. And one thing that's occurred to me, my book, all of the writing that has happened has been because of European contact, colonization, and the impacts of colonization. It's been some response to it or reaction to it, some way to manage or cope or learn how to adapt, some sort of response to it. My book, Colonization and the Wampanoag Story, directly addresses the history of colonization, which is still not something generally found in any school curricula, okay? And in Nothing More of This Land, if we were living in our traditional society, the need for this book, both of our books, would be moot, okay? And this regardless of any racial mixture of our community members, of which Joseph and I have different mixtures.
As you can see.
So Wamp stuff, though. Wamp dogs. Jojo, you jumped right in with both feet into an extremely sensitive topic that is not usually shared with the public, which is personal identity. In my experience, such issues were not discussed publicly, as it exposes you to so much misunderstanding, stereotypes, assumptions about who's Indian, who isn't, who gets to decide. So can you talk about why you wrote the book like you did and why you started off with, your personal journey?
Yeah, first, thanks to Linda and everybody for being here and hosting this event. As Linda said, the book has been out for about 2 weeks. And so it's very fresh, and this is exactly what I kind of was hoping for when I wrote the book, to have conversations with people who are engaged and interested in. Can you speak louder? Sorry, yes. Good conversations with people engaged and interested in these topics. And to Linda's first question, as we sort of talked about, just the way we look up here is your question about, people making assumptions or putting their own sort of interpretation on Wampanoag or Indigenous identity. People are doing that anyway. So, and I write in the book about working in my family's store on the Gay Head Cliffs in Aquinnah, and people come in and they say all sorts of wild stuff. They will ask you anything, they will say anything, they will take photos, and so people are already doing that. And so I saw the book as kind of like my opportunity to just fully say what I wanted to say about it. Because it's not as if we can exist in a world where people are never questioning our identity or never asking these questions. And so, yeah, there's a part of it I think that is vulnerable, and parts of it that I felt personally a little like nervous to share or uncomfortable talking about these things. And then there's also always the question of like, who cares about me? Why should I be writing this story? And I try to own that in the book as it's very much from my perspective, and I never want to be speaking for Linda or the tribe or even my family. I'm speaking for myself, and that's why I wanted to approach it in this way, to kind of like put my own perspective up front, like here's who I am, here's where I'm coming from, here's why I'm talking about these issues, and then use that as a way to get into these things and hopefully kind of bring you all as readers along with me, because a lot of this stuff I didn't know, and it's thanks to books like Linda's book that I've been able to learn a lot of these things. And I wanted to, not start the book from a place of, I know everything, let me tell you about who I am and my tribe. I wanted it to be more of like, I want to figure these things out. Like, let's figure it out together. And I think that's partially why we're all here tonight, so.
I think from my experience, I have a similar experience working with the public, because I spent 30 years at Plymouth Plantation in the Wampanoag program, 15 years talking to people on our home site. Same thing, they'll say anything, everything, and I've had people walk right up to me and go, oh, you're not Indian. Some stranger, right up, fresh off the parking lot, right?
When we were preparing, Linda described it as being on the front lines, which I think is accurate.
Yeah, it is. Because we were there to educate people, to talk about our culture, and for example, on the other side of the hill from us was the Pilgrim Village, and they're role-playing. So it's some guy that's role-playing William Bradford or Stephen Hopkins or Mary Allerton or whoever it was, but with us, it was Linda or Darius or some other, and that's a big difference. And we tried to deal with that, but I think for me, in that work, I got to a point where it was like, no, I'll tell you who I am. You don't tell me. And I don't know if it's not just Americans, I can attest to that. That have that sort of audacity to just walk up to a total stranger and say that, which the fact that they do tells you so much about the thinking about Native Americans, so that, for whatever it's worth, it helped me a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all grew up with that. Yeah, it's not uniquely American, but in many ways it's very American, the way we're raised to think about what it means to be Native. And so I think you grow up with that, and then you go to a place like Plymouth Plantation or the Cliffs, and you're working in a shop, and people come in and they're putting these questions on you, and you're wondering like, well, that does match up with what I was taught in school. Are they right? And yeah, it led, I think, to a lot of self-doubt at various times. But like Linda, eventually I came to this realization, like, no, these people don't know who I am. They don't know us. And
I think, what they don't know is a comment on at least American society and on the educational system.
yes.
To be that ignorant about the indigenous people of this land. So, and I think, that's, at Plymouth, that was my job to deal with that. Your job in the shop, that was sort of a byproduct that you just got to engage with anyway.
Well, we had to make money, people come in and you want them to like you because they're trying to buy some t-shirts or some wampum, and you're there like, I really don't want to do this right now, but I will. And sometimes you have a little bit, you'll probably understand this, sometimes you have a little bit more or less kind of energy for it.
Yeah. And
it also depends on them. Sometimes you can tell people are like well-meaning but ignorant, and some people are not well-meaning and ignorant. Right. And that's a very, that's a very different conversation to have.
Yeah.
And it affects your willingness to engage with that, I think. But yeah.
Just as a side note, there were times that at Plymouth when I went to work, and I was just, whatever reason, was in a bad mood. So I'd get into my skins, my regalia, and get my little weaving project and go down on the home site and try to sit somewhere where people wouldn't notice me. I'd be weaving away, you know, and I'd get the family every time. Oh, what are you doing? Weaving. Yeah. And they say, oh, and what are you making? A bag, you know. And they wouldn't, some people would get mad and walk off, which is, you know, what I was hoping they would do. And then these people would just stay and just draw me out. So by, 5 minutes into it, I'm like, yes, and we do hemp, and we did this, and the colors, and blah, 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 and I'm like chirping away, happy as a clam. They just brought me right out of my shell.
They're very sneaky.
Well, it's a kind of experience. It has its bad side, but it has a good side, because there's just so many wonderful people out there. We met people from around the world, and people are people. Some of them have that ignorance. Some of them don't. They have a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding, but they have the sensibility to understand that they have that. So that's really good when that happens. So you went from, in that first chapter, to when you were a kid growing up on the island and dealing with all of the identity stuff, to when you turned 18 and got your tribal ID and could go to meetings and really get in on the fun stuff of the tribe.
Fun.
Yeah. Because I'm reading the book and I'm like, ooh, he's in trouble. And so, I don't know, do you think you'll get any backlash from that?
I don't know. I've been saying that I think we're in a sweet spot. The book came out 2 weeks ago, and unless you're a pretty quick reader, it's like, hey, that guy wrote a book. That's pretty cool. I don't know what's in there. And so everybody's just very excited and supportive. So far, there hasn't been too much. My mom was, I think, pretty nervous about that.
Yeah.
She was like, you got to be careful, and she read it, and she was like, okay, actually, it's not that bad. You could have been a lot meaner.
That's true. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I did write about this experience of turning 18, and you get the tribal ID card, and it was kind of transitioning from being a kid in the tribe and going to tribal summer camp and like hanging out with the cousins, and you run around and we would catch snakes and arts and crafts, and we learned a little bit of the language at that time. And to me, that was the tribe. That was kind of the way I understood the tribe and what it meant to be Aquinnah. And then you turn 18 and suddenly I'm like, oh, those meetings that I've heard about, like I can go to them, and then you go and you're like, whoa, like I don't know what's going on in here. Yeah. And you learn a different side of the tribe, and some of that's good and some of that's difficult and complicated. And I think it's important, or it was for me, because it's adding these layers of complexity to what it means to be Indigenous. There's the community, cultural aspect that I had as a kid, and then you start learning about the political parts, the sovereignty parts, the financial parts, all these other things, and all of that adds complexity. And to Linda's point about knowledge, at that point I realized I really didn't know that much about our own tribal history. I just started showing up to meetings, and people were talking about things that happened a few years ago, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And that's when I realized that, I got to learn some of this stuff.
You talk a lot about what it means to be Indigenous, kind of throughout the book. That's a theme, and even when you were meeting other Indigenous people from around the world, you were having those conversations with them. What do you think that word means?
I mean, I think it's even worth thinking about the word itself and the way, one of the questions I get all the time, especially, in journalism, I do consulting for other outlets who want to write stories about Native communities. And they always ask, what words do we use? like, is it Native American? Is it Native? Is it Indigenous? Is it Indian? You know, what is it? And of course, usually the best answer is just say the tribe or say the community or be specific, right? Or ask the person what they want. But, you know, the language has evolved. And I think when I grew up, Native American was kind of the good one. And now I would say Indigenous is kind of the good one. But, you know, that will probably change a little bit too. And so I think to define it, I think you have to be aware of and include this sort of evolving nature of what it means. And the fact that we're always reconsidering what it means to be Indigenous, and that changes as the community changes. And so I think what happened to me is that, you know, you're learning about this in school, and from the outside, it's like Native Americans are this. And when the British first came here, they were like this. And the closer you are to that, the more Native American you are, right? Which obviously is not true, but we have to consider that and reckon with the way we include our own history and traditions in how we think of who we are. And so that's kind of how I think about it. And I think it's very personal. And I think what I found in the book is that there are a lot of people who embrace Indigenous identity in different ways. They might they might be an activist, they might be a storyteller, they might be a language worker. There are all sorts of ways. And I think for a long time, I thought that there was only one way, this kind of like pure Indigenous cultural ideal. And that's really not true at all. And it was interesting talking to some people about how they're wrestling with that too. Some of these people who I meet who are so outwardly, to me, Indigenous. Like, for example, there's this professional cyclist, bike racer, who actually just finished racing in the Tour de France. And he's Oneida. And he talks a lot about how he feels Indigenous because he grew up with that, and he feels Oneida and Native. But in many ways, he's not involved with the community because he's racing his bike in Europe all the time. And there are all these articles written about him, like first Native American doing all this stuff. And he's embracing that as a means to uplift the community and kind of spread awareness. But he's very aware that, like, he's not going to tribal meetings all the time. He's not learning the language. And so he's kind of like, I can only do this for so long without doing that other part. So I think it's kind of a balance of understanding that you don't have to do everything, but you do have to put in the time to engage. I think that's really how I've come to define being Indigenous, is making that choice to engage with your community and have a relationship with your culture and your land and your people and your history. But it's not just the history, right?
I think I don't see being Indigenous as being a choice. You are or you aren't.
Right.
And being, to me, and this is 50 years of me thinking about all of this, and I'm, you know, a couple years older than him. But to me, it has everything to do with the land that we come from, because that's what the Creator made us out of. Okay? And our language reflects that our DNA comes from the place of our origination, which in our case is Aquinnah. Okay? And regardless of how you might live your life today, because it could be anything, you're still that. You know, that's the foundation, that's the root, your roots, your anchor. You know, and then you can go anywhere in the world from there. And all I can think is, you know, I live in Mashpee with the Mashpee tribe, and, you know, unfortunately, all we do over there is have funerals. And it's like sometimes it'll be, you know, someone that's been away for 40 years. They might not even come home for powwow, you know, in July or whatever. But when they die, they come home. They want to go in that Mashpee ground with their ancestors, you know. And so it's not such an intellectual exercise, but to me, anyway, it's like an actual physical thing.
Yeah, I think the thing is a physical thing, and it's a rooted thing. It's more, I guess what I'm talking about is the aspect of like the day-to-day aspect of it.
Yeah.
'Cause I think that's what people get confused about, is like, does being Indigenous mean you're going to powwow every day and you're drumming or whatever it is? No, and it can, but it doesn't have to. Yeah.
Shoot, I'd live in Savers if I could. You know. You know, today there's all this talk about indigenizing the academy, or indigenizing this, or indigenizing the other thing. I mentioned the Bible. John Eliot was a missionary in the 17th century. Had the Bible translated, King James Bible, into the Wampanoag language, which he had to have Wampanoag people to do, because he didn't have that kind of proficiency, you know, with the language. And I've heard some of our folks that work in the language department now say it's different now. You know, it's a Wampanoag Bible, because there are so many concepts, you know, in Wampanoag cosmology and thinking that don't exist in English, and there's stuff in there that does not exist in our cosmology, that they had to create ways to get as close as they could to translate, you know. And therefore, the Bible has become like a cultural item, if you will, that particular Bible.
Yeah, I don't think indigenize just mean like indigenize the academy. It doesn't just mean like hire some native folks.
No, not at all.
It's them going in there and changing things up.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the trick, because a lot of times people go, oh yeah, well, we just hired 3 Indians on staff. What do you want? We want you to change the whole curriculum. Oh, you know.
Let them do what they want to do. Yeah. Let them change it the way they think. Yeah.
Exactly. So.
Yeah.
All right. So you were talking about, one thing I found very interesting was the Maasai. You were talking about the Maasai at one point, and I've always admired them, you know, very much. And what I wrote it down, what you said, that access to essential services were cut off to force them to move. Could you talk about that? Because that's
So this is a situation that I covered as a journalist, and this is mostly the Maasai in Tanzania. The situation in Kenya is a little bit different. But what's happening there is the national parks where people go on safari, and you see the elephants and the big five and, you know, whatever, and the beautiful savanna landscape and all of this stuff. You know, that's Maasai land, where they've been living and cultivating land, which is a really important part of it, because the government is now saying that the Maasai, through their cattle herding and livestock grazing and all this, is actually bad for the land, bad for tourism, and bad for all these things. And so they want them to move. And one of the really sinister parts of this that you find is that they kind of like it if there are like a couple there, you know, like in that little village over there, and we can go look at them. But if there are too many, that's a bad thing, because then it'll be uncontrollable. And so you can actually find in UNESCO has written these reports, and it's like, we recommend, you know, population control and, you know, like birth control and this sort of thing. And this goes all the way back to like Belgian colonial times that they've been trying to do this. And they actually write in some of these documents, like some of them who we like to keep, you know, 100 of them. The rest of them we would prefer to remove. And so what's happening today is in these basically safari parks is they're trying to evict them, and in some cases it's violent evictions, essentially, like police security forces go in and remove people. In other cases, what they're doing is they're just cutting off services. So what Linda's talking about, they're cutting hospital services, they're cutting funding for schools, and then they're saying, and then there's this other village we set up like over there where the white people don't go, or you'll be out of the way, and we put a hospital there. So maybe you'd like to move over there. And yeah, it's part of this whole like sinister ploy to get them off their land and essentially break their culture and their way of life, and take everything they have and move them to this other place, and just keep the couple who will, you know, be in the photos.
Yeah, because what that that's colonization at its finest, you know. That sounds like, you know, the Maasai version of the Trail of Tears.
Yep.
or the Maasai version of, in the 19th century in this country when they were slaughtering all the buffalo, which was a main source of food for the Lakota people, and it forced the Lakota into starvation.
Yeah.
You know,
They're kidnapping their cattle, their livestock, essentially, and then they're charging them these exorbitant taxes to get them back. So exactly the same.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, and that happened here, not with cattle, but with land. We were thrust from our traditional economy into a money economy. We didn't have money. So it's like, oh, well, we'll put you down on the book for that $5, and if you can't pay it, you can pay me with 5 acres of your allotment land, and that's just everyday colonization. It just happened all over the place, all the time, apparently all around the world.
And still happening.
Still happening, yes. Yeah. Well, I look at it, I mean, the way that taxes are now in Aquinnah,
Yeah.
it's just the same thing. I mean, you could start in 1620 in our case, and follow that thread right up till you get to the tax office in Aquinnah today. Yeah. So there's all sorts of ways to cut off services, for people.
It's the same story around the world, and I think that was one of the most rewarding parts of the book, was seeing those connections. And I think that's also the project of colonization, is to make you not see those connections,
Right.
and to make you only like, I'm just trying to survive, or
Yes.
I'm trying not to lose my house.
Yeah.
And then you don't realize that, oh, that's happening in Aquinnah and Mashpee and Ecuador and Tanzania and California. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
And 45 other places.
Right.
And you were talking about sovereignty. I mean, and you were talking about steps to being sovereign. And did you have a definition of sovereignty? Did you ever?
I'm not. Leave that to the experts.
Okay. Because, as federally recognized tribes,
Right.
which Mashpee is and Aquinnah is, we are domestic sovereigns, which is actually an oxymoron.
Right.
Probably heavy on the moron if you think about it, but because,
You're sovereign, but we control you.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because federally recognized tribes, all of our federal lands are just that, they're federal. They're not actually owned, by Wampanoag people or any tribe that's federally recognized. So with the swipe of a pen, or some politician gets in a funny mood, there it goes. That's what happened with Mashpee a few years ago.
Yeah.
With their land into trust. So it's very, I can't think of the word. Precarious, yeah. Wifty. It just isn't solid, something. But I think that our ancestors were sovereign.
Yeah.
And they were sovereign because we had 69 villages in our nation, and each village was autonomous. And while they all intermarried, worked together, did stuff to get whatever, because that's what people do, if they needed to, they could be completely self-sufficient. They could feed themselves, clothe themselves, keep themselves warm, build their houses, whatever, medicine, whatever they needed, they could provide it themselves without destroying the earth. I think that's the definition of sovereign. To me, that's a root definition, and then, and anything else is, whatever it's become.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of sovereignty we should be trying to get back to, right? And I think
Yeah.
there's a federal government version of sovereignty which can offer you certain things, But I think the mistake that I made, and maybe some other people sometimes make, is you think that that's the only version of sovereignty, or that's the limit of sovereignty. But I think the limit of sovereignty is, well, maybe there isn't one, but it's what you're talking about, is actual sovereignty, not like the federal government says you can have these things because the paper says so.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. You were talking about distractions too, at some point, which is, I think being a domestic sovereign is a version of that. And all of the stuff that you were just saying, oh man, I got a mortgage to pay. I got to pick the kids up. I got to go get my groceries, my car just died. These are all distractions with the stuff of the society that we live in today, And it seems to be, they seem to be all over the world too, which is, to distract from the extraction of resources, I guess, Yeah,
so. And there are all these things you have to learn to even talk about it, which is also a distraction. And, there's federal recognition, there's state recognition, but then not every state has state recognition, and every state has a different policy for state recognition. And so all these things that, I think it's like you're fighting to get something that really isn't something that great.
Yeah.
But you have to have it.
Yeah.
If you want to do anything, you have to have it, but you get it, and then what do you have?
You were talking about the Wampus people, which I thought that was a very cool name.
Wampis.
Yeah. That name just struck a chord with me.
Yeah, that's
They're in Peru?
They're in Peru in the Amazon, and I met them. They are dealing with oil extraction on their land, and I met them in what I thought was a really cool situation, because the oil company is like one of the national oil companies in Peru, but it's heavily invested in by like US and international banking institutions. And so the Peruvian government does not listen to them. And they don't really have federal recognition or anything like that. In Peru, they have sort of village recognition, which is a little bit different. And so the government's not listening to them. So they said, okay, we're going to go to the people who pay you. So they flew to New York and tried to set up these meetings with like Citibank and these big financial companies. And so I met them when they came to New York, kind of like on the eve of these meetings that they were going to have. And it was a really cool moment for me to share kind of our experiences, but also what they had done is they had declared, rather than the individual villages that are recognized by the Peruvian government, and that's one way the government divides them, is they'll go to one village and like bribe the guy in charge, and then say, well, that guy said we could put the pipeline through all of your land, and it's just one guy. But what they did is they decided to create a unified nation, what they're now calling the Wampis Nation, and say we're united and we're electing our own leaders, and we're going to send them to New York, and we're going to send them to the UN, and we're going to have them do this work to advocate for us. And they were kind of explaining it to me, like, I know it's weird, a nation in a nation. And I was like, you don't got to tell me, but. And they were like, oh, that's cool. So like it works here. Well, don't get too excited. But I think it was an interesting example of like, these are the tools we have. And to a certain extent, you have to use the tools we have, but also you have to do the other thing.
Well, what's interesting with them is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, we're a tribe of first contact in this country. Mm-hmm. And I think people in South America, at least now, are dealing with it much more newly. They have a stronger, traditional, I'll use that word to describe their own way of living, much more intact that they're starting from.
Yeah, I think that's mostly true. And I mean, there are, in the Amazon, there are uncontacted communities too, who they call it voluntarily isolating, that they want to be left alone there. And then there's some like the Wampis who are like more, they want to engage with society because they see a benefit. Yeah.
There's another group down there that I heard about a number of years ago, the Kayapo. Mm-hmm. And they have been, like the Wampis, been trying to really construct their own society in the face of resource extraction or whatever, or land taking, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, there was a really great line one of the Wampese leaders said to me, where he was explaining what they're doing, and he's like, it's a little bit weird that we've had these structures in our society for forever, but now we're having to write it down because that's the only way the government respects you. And he said this line that's like, we've had this society for over 7,000 years, and Peru has only been a country for whatever.
Yeah.
And he's like, it's like a baby telling, somebody else what to
Right.
do, and like Peru is the baby in that case, and,
Yep.
and they're the experts. And,
Yeah. And one thing I noticed, they said that the health of the land is the same as the health of the people.
Yeah. And that's why it matters, to them. It's not like some abstract, I'm going to protect these trees over here and then protect my family over here. It's all exactly the same.
Right.
And I think that is the same for all of us, but it looks different.
Yeah.
Right?
What do you mean it looks different?
I mean, we're not in the Amazon, first of all.
Yeah.
But also just, like you're saying, we don't live that same, maybe, we'll call it the more traditional way. So our relationship with the land is important, but it's different, I think. It's evolved.
It's been colonized.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's evolving or devolving.
Sure.
But
it's changed, let's say. Yeah.
I think I'd go with devolving. Because one thing, like when I was at Plymouth, people used to, especially in the 70s and 80s, people used to think that we only lived to be 35, 40 years old, and we just, keel low, that was it. Such a hard life, And what we would tell them was that no, our people lived to be 70 or 80. Wasn't uncommon for people to reach 100. And people were just shocked. Well, how could they live that long? And back in those days, I was just starting out in my career, and I'm like, one of those moments where we really got to think on your feet, And I'm like, well, they had clean air, clean water, clean earth. And, it was a few years later, and I found out, thank God, that was the right answer. But I think of that, because we didn't have all the heavy communicable diseases that exist in this society. We didn't have them, look at the situation with people's health today, with allergies and, what all the stuff that's just cropping up more recently. And it's like the more we destroy the natural world, the more we have these issues. And it's like, and I think, thank God there's some people in the world, the Wampese, and I know there's lots of other people, but they fully understand that concept and live it. And that's what needs to happen, I believe, here. So.
Yeah. Someone's just got to let us do it.
Yeah. Yeah, all we need is, all of our land back.
Now accepting donations.
Yeah. Oh. You talked quite a bit about language, talking with different people and their languages, like I don't know how to say it, from Okinawa.
Yeah.
Who are those folks?
It's the indigenous people from Okinawa, and so it's the Ryukyu Islands, but
Ryukyu?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like RYU.
Yeah.
But they, I guess, would say that's the island chain, but they would probably say more specifically that they're Uchi Nanchu. And then the language is Uchi Naguchi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they were talking about how I have here language in relation to the natural world And I have another note about language here somewhere. Language is culture.
So one of the guys from Okinawa that I met, he's a PhD candidate studying to be a language teacher right now. And one of the things that he told me is, in Okinawa, they have a huge problem with mostly US military bases, which it's like 20% of the land on the island is US military bases. And increasing every year, they're trying to build a new one right now. And, it's desecrating grave sites, it's destroying reefs, it's bad for the shoreline, it's bad for everything, basically. And this guy essentially came up in these activist spaces against the bases. And at that time, he told me that he sort of thought that language was like this side thing, like less, I need to fight the bases, and then maybe later I can learn the language.
Yeah.
And then what he came to realize when he moved to Hawaii, and they have obviously a really robust like culture, language revitalization, is he realized that they're connected. It's this like fighting the bases, protecting the land, strengthening the community, and learning the language is all the same work,
Yes.
or it's related work at least. And so he gave a lot of examples of, the way that, like Linda's saying in the Wampanoag Bible, that it's not just like a word for word translation, it's the ideas are being reinterpreted through the thought process. And so he describes that, and there's small examples in the book, like in their language, they don't say my mother, you say our mother, because it's like the mother for the whole community. And so there are examples like that where it's like the language and culture are intertwined,
Yes.
and you can't talk about one without the other.
Yeah, it's like the language is a map of their worldview and thinking. And I think one of my favorite, I'm certainly not fluent by any stretch of the imagination, but one of my favorite examples that I heard from one of our people that works with the language is, and this is in regard to the Bible, when the Wampanoag people were translating it, they came across the word hell.
Yeah.
And we don't have hell, heaven or hell or any, that's just not part of our thing, not part of our cosmology, our thing, it's not there. So they were discussing, how can they translate this word? So they were looking at, what essentially does hell mean? And the word that they came up with translates to empty skull. And when I heard that, I was like, that's freaky.
Yeah.
It's kind of up there with zombie apocalypse and all that, And it was a couple of years later, I took a language class, and our linguist was just in a, kind of side conversation, was talking about how Wampanoag people believe that the soul resides in the brain. And the first thing I thought of was like, oh my God. So if you have an empty skull, you don't have a soul. I could think of somebody right now that's like that.
Just one?
One big one, pops to mind.
Yeah.
That thought is so deep. And I'm like, who's trying to convert who here? But it's that kind of thing that really defines the Bible. Why I see why our cousin was saying that the Wampanoag Bible is really a Wampanoag Bible, because of stuff like that. Because it's just there's stuff in it that just does not exist in Western society or English language or anything like that. And I think it's that, the language, from my understanding of it now, that really, it's one of the things that makes me say that, because a lot of times people say, oh, everybody's the same, blah, 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 human nature. And I'm like, I'm not so sure, because people that grow up in this Western society that we live in today, our ancestors didn't live in that. So they're not gonna have the same thought patterns, responses, thinking, ways of doing things, ways of looking at the world. It's gonna be very different. So I think, language is hugely important. And what you were saying about, you can't say my mother, you have to say our mother. We have stuff like that in Wampanoag too. So it's nice, really cool to see those connections.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think the best part of, well, the two best parts for me of learning the language are those little moments where you learn not just like vocabulary, but you're learning worldview and the way of understanding and relationality. And then the other nice part, which I write a little bit about in the book too, is like having these conversations with each other.
Yeah.
Right? It's coming together and learning those things together and figuring out like, oh, this is how our ancestors saw the world, and here's how, we could take that now, and using that not just as a space like, let me get my flashcards, but as a space for community building and like doing that work. Yeah.
Let me ask you, you've been all over the world talking to people, looking for their answers to these questions that we've been discussing. And did you talk to folks right at home?
You mean Aquina?
Yeah.
Yeah. I talked to a few. I mean, I talk to my mom a lot. She's got to talk to mom.
She keeps him in line.
She does. I went back through a lot of my grandfather's old stuff. That was a cool part of writing the book, is finding his old records and notes, these like real crusty manila folders with land deeds and all this information. And then, I talked to folks in the tribe, some of our tribal leaders, cousins like Amira and Nadeja, and people kind of around my age, but then, a bunch of other folks.
Oh, okay. Because I didn't see that other than Amira and Nadeja as much,
Yeah, there were a lot of some of the more political ones that I talked to all of the chair people. Talked to, kind of in order, I talked to Donald, Tobias, Cheryl, and I left a lot of that out.
Right.
Yeah. My mom was happy about that.
Oh my goodness. Because one thing that jumped out at me, you said, I can't remember, it was toward the end, I think, you're talking about recipes. And you didn't have a source for like traditional recipes. And I was like, oh, you just didn't talk to the right people.
Well, I mean, I think what it's, I know who those people are, and I've been to the, but I think it's more like what I was comparing it to was what I thought other tribes had that I thought I didn't have. So even, me going to, an event and Christina's cooking something up, I kind of knew that was like a traditional thing, but because it didn't have this, like, to be honest, sort of stereotypical native flavor to it, I was like, oh, that's just me like hanging out at the tribe. And it was only later that I realized, like, oh, those things are the traditional things, or that is cultural, or that is Wampanoag. And so I think it was more the way I was seeing it had to change than actually what it was.
Yeah. Because I can remember thinking, and this is when I was, up until I was working at the Aquina Cultural Center, which I started there in 2010. And I don't know if you're familiar with what we call the oral histories, all the interviews.
Yeah, I think my brother did a bunch of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
But up until, when was it? I think it was 2015 or 16, I did a project using those interviews, and I had to read all the transcripts. And up until then, I knew that folks in Mashpee had held on to a lot. There's a lot of knowledge in that tribe. And I thought our folks, I didn't see it. And I thought we had forgotten a lot of stuff until I read those transcripts. And then I was like, okay, I was wrong.
We got stuff.
Yeah. I mean, these were interviews that were done in the 70s and the 80s with elders that were alive at that time. But there was so much in them, so much information, and the project I did regarded land, and I literally was cutting sentences, out of the transcripts and just lining stuff up till I had a story, and what people were saying about land, I mean, they didn't forget anything.
No.
And I think they were, people were upset at what was going on, seeing so many other people move in and just sort of take over and, take over the town offices and just disregard the Wampanoag community and the way that they felt about that and the anger that they felt about that. And I think a lot of times people are afraid to express that because they don't want to be rude.
Right.
And I'm thinking, you don't want to be rude. They're being rude to you more than a little bit.
They took it.
Yeah. So that was just eye-opening for me, and not over the years I've learned to not dismiss any source at all. 'Cause you just never know where that one little nugget that's gonna drop into place and just, put it all together for you.
And a lot of that got passed down. So the elders in the 70s then are passing it down to maybe my grandfather, for example. And,
Yeah.
he had a lot of that information, but to me, he was just my grandfather. And, I never thought about, all this stuff. And I kind of knew his childhood stories of growing up in the lighthouse and all these things,
Yeah.
but I didn't always draw that connection between the way they thought about land and community and who they were.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes even now, then he passed that down to my mom, and so I feel well, I need to get it from her and from other people. But sometimes when I drive around town with my mom, I'm like, well, who lived there, and who had that land, and what was that?
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
because that's the only way we can keep it.
Yeah.
I think, and hopefully we'll write more of it down. But
Yeah.
or those oral histories. Yeah.
I think one of my favorite stories in those oral histories was Phyllis Vanderhoop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You call her Fitty.
Yeah.
Fitty. Her nickname was Fitty, short for Phyllis.
She lived to 180.
Well, she lived to 100.
Yeah.
She did.
Yeah.
I can say Wampanoag people come up with some nicknames. I can tell you that. But she was talking about as a kid, or a young person anyway. So we're talking maybe the 20s or the 30s, 1920s or 30s, and she was just going on about something, and she was talking about cornmeal Injun dumplings in the interview, and I was like, well, that's an odd way to phrase it.
I don't know about that, Fitty.
Yeah, because she was like, oh boy, she says, they went down just like sinkers. And I was like, she's talking about Indian corn, actual Indian corn, not Quaker cornmeal, because you could make dumplings out of that, but it's not going to go down like a sinker. But if you take actual flint corn and you dry it out and you grind it into meal, that's stick to your ribs food right there, okay? And I was like, oh my God, there's only one place to get that. That was right in our community, And I think people were growing our traditional corn, into the 60s or later, Because, once I get a little nugget like that, I keep adding to it. And so I was talking to Adriana one day, who's a young lady in her early 70s now. And she was talking about 50 years ago, and she was in college, out in New Mexico.
Yeah, Utah.
Institute for American Indian Arts.
Yeah, Santa Fe. Yeah.
And there's summer at which kids from a lot of tribes go to that school, and their summer assignment was to bring back a traditional recipe from their tribe. So Adriana comes home and she's like, I have no idea. So she's asking her mother and her aunts and, you know, other ladies in the family, and they were like, why don't you make no cake? Okay, what's no cake? She didn't even know what that was. But when that word came out of her mouth, I almost fell off my chair. No cake is made, I was talking about the flint corn, and if you dry the kernels and grind it in, and you take the dried kernels and you parch them, which as you know probably is just cooking something in a hot pan with no water, no oil, and you just have to constantly stir, and the kernels will swell, and they don't pop because it's not popcorn, that's a specific type of corn, but they'll split, they'll swell and they'll split. And then at that point, you can grind that into meal, and it tastes different from regular unparched cornmeal, has a nutty flavor. It's very good. And it's something that our ancestors made. It's a dish from the 17th century, you know? And I was like, so 1970, this girl's making no cake? You know, we have a little cookbook from 74, there's recipes for no cake in there. You know,
Yep.
and that just blew me away that we had that, you know, lasting to present day, you know. So.
We have more than I think sometimes we even realize.
Yeah.
You just have to find it and go
Yes.
back, and it's like it's not held centrally,
Right.
but individual people, individual families
Yeah.
have these things, and
Yeah,
so it's you
exactly.
know, and that's why this oral history project and similar projects I think are so important, because it's collecting some of that
Yes.
and putting it in one place, and then everybody can go and look at it. And I think that's the work that
Yeah.
we have to do, is like piece together those things and make sure they don't get lost, but then also bring them together so everybody can have them
Yep.
and understand that we have them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've
We
made
did-
it to
we did it.
6:05. So, I'd like to open it up to any questions, comments? Criticisms will be accepted that way. Yes. Oh,
Hi.
sorry.
First of all, thank you for coming out, we really appreciate it. I just wanted to ask, when you were researching and writing the book, what was something that you learned that really surprised you, that you didn't know anything about before you started?
Yeah, it's a good question about what surprised me. I don't know if there was one thing. I mean, I think I went into it knowing that I really didn't know a lot, and I'm leaving it also knowing that I don't know a lot. It's like Linda saying, I think the most important thing is maybe realizing how much you don't know. But, you know, even little things like, I write a little bit in the book about the family name Vanderhoop, which is my middle name and my mom's last name, and people may know that it's like a huge family in the tribe. There are Vanderhoops everywhere. And I didn't know where that came from, and I had kind of like assumed, like, I don't know, some Dutch guy snuck on the Mayflower or something, and, you know, like that's what it was, and that's not what happened. Obviously, I probably should have known that, but it's this whole other complicated part of the history. And so little things like that, like even these things that I just assumed were like, oh, it's probably that. You know, you get into the research and you realize it's not even true. Or, you know, like the 1602 Martha's Vineyard thing, I really didn't know what that was, because in school I learned, well, you know, like 1620 is the year, right? Like that's kind of when it all started.
Typo.
Right, yeah. I was like, you know, Mom, we have this shot glass at the store and I think it's wrong. Because I didn't know and I just assumed, and I think that shows a few things. One of them is that like the education is just terrible, just atrocious. And I think we all need to be asking a lot more questions about that. So really tiny things like when, you know, white people first came to Martha's Vineyard, which also probably not 1602, looking at Vikings and
That was Gosnold.
yeah, Gosnold is 1602. Yeah, exactly. You know, and my own family name, there's just so much that I didn't know. So in a way, everything was a little bit surprising, but also nothing was, because I knew, like, I don't know anything. I'm going to learn a a bunch of stuff. So I was ready to be surprised, I guess.
There was a question up here, Kathy.
It's kind of an ignorant question. I'm from North Carolina. We always hear about the Wampanoag, but you refer to yourselves as a Quina. Is that just, what is the difference? And is that just from the Cape versus Martha's Vineyard, or is it something else?
I'll use the word nation, and I use it loosely, but at one point we had 69 different communities. Today we have 3, which is Aquina, Mashpee, and Herring Pond in South Plymouth, okay? And all of those people, whether it's the 3 or all 69, those are all Wampanoag people. We all spoke the same language. So we're Aquina Wampanoag.
It's just a more specific
Yeah,
part
we
of the
just-
whole.
We just, we know what we mean, so we just say Aquina.
Yeah.
Or Wamps,
Womp it up.
Yeah.
I can see that you have a wonderful sense of humor, which enables us to, I think, sort of relax and be able to get into what you need to tell us. But underlying that is something that I didn't address necessarily, and that is trauma. And of course, any of us who have even read Mayflower, something as simple as that, once we get into those chapters, we have to address trauma. And some experts are now saying that that can be epigenetic, that the trauma can go from generation to generation. Did you address that at all in your book?
You want to go first? Your book and then my book. Yeah.
I think in my book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I wrote a story because we have no documented source that accurately describes our traditional life. So I wrote a story in the life of a family in which there's a 12-year-old girl. My book is written for 7th grade. And we go through a year in the life of these people and their extended family and community so I can describe to people what life was like, and as much as I could, the thinking, the worldview, and all of that. From that point, and someone earlier on the way in was saying, oh, I love the way the book goes back and forth between the nonfiction story and then the historical fiction and then the nonfiction sections. Well, that was my editor's choice, not mine. I thought my story was going to be chapter 1, because I'm thinking totally chronologically, Because the next part I start with the 15th century, the doctrine of discovery. Do people know what that is? Okay, does anyone not know what that is?
Couple
people, okay. The doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulletins that were issued in which the Pope was saying that Christians can go into the lands of non-Christians and take their lands, enslave the people, take whatever riches that the land has to offer, hopefully gold. That's always number 1 on the list.
They love gold.
Yeah, and even kill the people, because if you're not Christian, you weren't really human. Okay, that's trauma right there. And it wasn't, but 32, and then, let me see, that was 1452, so 40 years later we have Columbus. And he was responsible for the deaths of some 60 million people. 60 million. Because they weren't human. So it was okay to maim and torture and kill them and whatever, feed them to the dogs, whatever he felt like doing that day. But then 32 years after Columbus, we get the first explorer coming up into this area. Giovanni de Verrazzano in 1524. And then that sort of kicked off, the age of exploration here, and until 1620, there was there were 100 ships or whatever a year going back and forth. They were exploring, they were trading with native people, they were fishing, which extractively, and they were taking slaves, you know. So it just, and on it, the whole thing of colonization is traumatizing. Because it was all meant to do something with us so that somebody else could have the land or whatever resources are on the land.
The question is, how do you integrate that in the storytelling, and how do you, in other words, it's in addition to other stories and spirituality, how do you deal with that trauma? How does the tribe itself deal with, say, the King Philip's War, or whatever else that they might do, that they may encounter in reading history, telling it in your way? Is what I'm thinking. How is it that you deal with this?
King Philip's
And the spirituality.
King Philip's War was 1675, and when the Pilgrims landed in 1620, I mean, one thing, they just came here. They thought they had the right to just come in and start building their village, and they did. They didn't bother to ask our leadership, you know, they just came in, and there'd been a huge plague through here, but even so, there was still some 20,000, give or take, Wampanoag people left, not to mention other tribes. It's like the Narragansett were not affected by that plague in particular. And in 1621, probably know this history, but Massasoit signed a treaty of mutual protection with the English. And that, at least as far as the Wampanoags, I think we're about 5 minutes into it and the English violated it, but it's what they do. So, it lasted up until the time of Massasoit's death in 1660. And at that time, when he passed, his oldest son, Wamsutta, became sachem. And Wamsutta got, you know, I think the day after he became sachem, he was hauled into Plymouth because they were always paranoid that we were plotting against them and, you know, and all of this sort of thing. And there wasn't anything like that going on at the time, but they hauled him into Plymouth to answer that question. And when he left to go home, he died on the way. And it was suspected that he was poisoned. And that just was not a good look for the English in Wampanoag people's eyes. But when Wamsutta passed, Philip, or Metacom, then became sachem. And that was roughly 1662, 4, along in there. But the war didn't happen for another 10, 11 years, 75. And in those 10 or 11 years, he continued to try to negotiate with the English, because that was our traditional way, to negotiate, to come to consensus, to work something out that's good for everybody. And it just became way too apparent that was not going to work, because the English just wanted everything, and they were taking it, and they were, you know, instituting all of these methods of colonization, Christianity, convert or die. There were so many systems, you know, that were imposed against us, you know, and we had reservations, we had praying towns. Reservations are where they put Indians over here, as Jojo was saying. You know, you put the Indians over here on land nobody else wants at the moment. Aquina was a reservation.
They all want it now.
Because it was way up island, it was hard to get to, and now the name of the game is the taxes. There's no way, you know, that are very difficult for people that don't live on tribal lands. It's bad enough on tribal lands to have a house and pay the taxes on it, you know, and there's billionaires. Which is not us, by the way.
Someday soon.
Yeah. And so, I mean, and all of that is trauma. Because, you know, this is our homeland. This is where we come from. This is our DNA is in that land. Our ancestors buried in that land, and they don't care. You know, now there's a thing where they want to put in a corridor from, you know, one spot in town up to the town hall for about a mile or so. And
Right past my house.
right past is his house, and most of the homeowners, the majority of them in that strip are Wampanoag people who are trying to hang on to their land for dear life. And one of the ideas with this corridor thing is that land could be subdivided and sold or built on, and it's like, no. I feel like telling people, you get the hell out of Aquinnah, go right down the road a couple miles to Chilmark. You all got the whole rest of the island now. You don't have to have this place. You know, there's just no need for people to have everything, and we're constantly responding to this kind of onslaught. That's how it feels, you know. And so, you know, that is very traumatic, because you feel like you can't relax.
And I think that sort of lineage that Linda's laying out is so important, and that's one of the things to your question about, like, how do we treat it in the book, is that, you know, I'm not a historian, and you know, I can't do what Linda does, and so I think it's all, these are pieces of the puzzle coming together. And you know, it's something that I thought about, like, how much of that do I want to put in, and how much of the history. And to me, what I felt is I needed to put in enough to get to where I was going, but leave it to people like Linda to do that historical work. And also what I was trying to do is what we're talking about up here is what's happening today, right? And that it's not, and I think that's a mistake that gets made a lot, is like thinking of historical trauma as something. I think there's a growing awareness. I think there can always be more of like colonization 400 years ago, and that it was a bad thing and that it happened. I think people are starting to get that a little bit, but it's a lot harder to look at it as what happened last week.
Yeah.
As the same thing, just continuing through the years.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm trying to do in the book, is like draw that line so we get there. And like, when, you know, and I think that's why some of the examples around the world are helpful. It's always useful, and this is what I found, is it's always useful to look at an experience outside of your own to help you understand, because when it's right in front of you, right, it's harder to see. But then when you go and you see these tourism parks and the way they're treated, and you're thinking about Linda at Plymouth Plantation and me up at the cliffs, it's like, well, wait a minute. And you start to see the connection, and you start to see that this is the same thing just throughout the years. It was allotment, and then it was taxes, and then it's whatever it is, but it's the same thing. And so I think when we talk about trauma and colonialism, I think that's the way that we're trying to see it. But it's an important question.
I'm gonna take a question back here and
First of all, I want to say, I finished your book this afternoon. It was great, I recommend it.
Thank you.
I read Linda's book last year, it was good too. And I've learned a lot, which is very important to me, so I recommend it to everybody. If I learned something, it's worth my time. But there were a couple of things that I found interesting that I'd like you to elaborate on. Particularly the Wampanoags. But the two issues that I do were unsettling to me were exclusionary practices. The one was disenrollment, tribal disenrollment, and I think the term right,
Blood quantum.
With other tribes excluding people who would otherwise be eligible for membership and are denied the benefits. Again, I believe you said it did not happen with the Wampanoags, but other tribes in the United States. Okay.
So the question broadly, I think, is about membership policies in every tribe. And this relates to the question we were talking about earlier of federal recognition and what the federal government wants you to have. And every tribe, sovereign tribe, determines its own membership policy. And so in the Wampanoag, in the Aquinnah Wampanoag, we don't have a blood quantum, which is like you have to be 1/4, whatever, or 1/8, whatever you are, to be an official member or citizen of the tribe. And so we don't have that. And then the other part of your question about disenrollment is that basically what disenrollment is getting rid of a member or a citizen of the nation. And it can happen for a lot of different reasons in a lot of different ways. And what I was looking at in particular is what, some people are calling kind of like an epidemic of disenrollment, where these mass disenrollments that people are basically saying it's driven by, interfamily squabbles or greed of not wanting to share income or benefits in the tribe. And they're like, that whole family is gone out of the tribe. And so that's like 100 people out of the tribe. And, that's kind of what I'm looking at. And yeah, I think it's, I would agree it's unsettling and troubling. And I think it's one of those like tricky topics to talk about, but it's something that I think we have to talk about. And I also think that's another example of, I'm not here trying to tell any other tribe what they should or should not do, because that's up to them, I think. But I do think it's something that collectively we should be talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so we're guilty. I know the white guy is guilty. But
Good start.
what do you propose in your wisdom of all your research for a progressive forwarding of helping the injustices within a realistic format? I mean, how do you go? What is the? I guess it's political. Well, what is the political platform that would be the right way, the right path to go? And my second question is a very particular one, because I have a son-in-law who's an FBI agent, and we've had a couple conversations. But the Wampanoag have their own justice system, which was surprising to me, or he says that they do. I can tell by the thing, yeah, but it doesn't work. Okay. But you might comment on that.
You want to hit the justice system?
Oh, let it go.
Well, I think, both, as I said earlier, both Mashpee and Aquinnah are federally recognized tribes. And I think Mashpee, even though it's a more newly federally recognized, is more organized with their justice system than we are, because they do have a functioning tribal court. And they will bring in, when necessary or when needed, a judge that's a native person. Am I right, Fenton? Good.
And there are,
We have several judges that we work with.
Yeah.
and there are across the country, you'll find that there are these folks who are like native judges, and they'll often
Yeah.
serve as a judge for a few different tribes.
Right.
Sometimes.
Yeah. So, but, in Aquinnah, I don't have the word to describe what we have.
We're working on it.
Yeah, we're working on it.
We're working on it. Yeah.
Work in progress.
Yeah. But the other part of the question.
How about the first question? You have a political, so to speak, platform? You have nature, I have.
You got a list?
It's difficult. Because, I talk to people about, we got to quit destroying the earth because blah, 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 and pollution and plastic and, and all of that stuff. And people are like, well, we can't go back. And I'm thinking, we can't go back to what? And number two, you're going to tell me we're moving forward with this? We're not. What we need is a paradigm shift. People need to begin to think differently about the way that we walk on this earth. I have no idea how to begin that. I mean, I do, but it's complicated and long.
My quicker part of the answer, I guess, is I think you have to look locally. I think it's very easy to look nationally and be like,
Yeah.
The BIA, the Interior, Deb Haaland did some good stuff, whatever, and now it's bad. And I think it's very easy to do that, and like, what can we do? But I think, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is very well-meaning people in Aquinnah, well-meaning, they want those big national changes, but they're trying to take our land in Aquinnah, right? Or trying to, I got to catch up on this corridor thing. My dad was kind of filling me in. I don't know all the
Yeah.
details yet. But, like there are these local projects that I think that's where normal people can actually make an impact. And you can find out what the tribe wants or doesn't want, or what's going to benefit them or not, and how these local land use, land decision, conservation is another big one, and that's another parallel with what happens here, what happens in places like in Kenya and Tanzania, is saying this like big white NGO knows how to conserve land, and you natives don't. You're just trying to hunt here. It's like, well, like wait a minute, So I think it's things like that can actually happen on a local level in a real way.
Good evening. My name is Benjamin Solis, and I'm a master Wampanoag. In regards to your question, starting at the federal level would be in instances where Camp Edwards and Otis is being decommissioned, we would like that back. In instances where there is townland that is not currently used, particularly in Mashpee, we would like that back. Now I'm going to digress. That's my personal answer. Question for Linda. In our language, are there words that delineate property lines or borders? I'm not aware there are.
We had boundaries between villages, between nations.
But not individual.
It's like community bound, right?
I think it was Roger Williams who was talking about how people were very punctual, was the word he used, about their boundaries. So very specific. And I know that, like we use runners to deliver a message from one sachem to another, and the protocol, there was protocol as well, that if you were going to go into somebody else's village, your first stop was at the home of the sachem to apprise him of why you're there, particularly if you're a runner with a message or whatever. Because a lot of times people, you didn't have boundaries, you just lived on the land and you ran with the deer and flew with the foxes and, all of this kind of, stupid stuff. And no, we had boundaries. And they were formed by rivers or lakes or mountains or, this sort of thing, but they were very specific. It wasn't like property lines like today. But, if you were going into someone else's territory, there were protocols involved with that, and a lot of times, like I can remember Jesse saying that Pokanoket, which is Warren and Bristol, Rhode Island, and I forget what the word Pokanoket means, but is something about, there were several people that went there, not people, but tribes. In this case, it would have been, I think, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Pequot, or sort of roughly in the neighborhood somewhere. But they all went there to plant because the ground was so fertile. So, and a lot of times hunting areas or fishing, areas were joint, if you will, between two villages or six or, what have you. But these people would sit down and negotiate that and work out their terms, if you will, and agree on how this would happen. Because I know that if there was stuff like if a deer was killed in water or something, somehow that its hide went to the sachem. So that there were, rules, if you will, like that. So there was this type of structure to our society. There has to be. There has to be. We weren't a bunch of hippies running around.
National park should be turned over to Indigenous stewardship. Number 2, land back. Number 3, the state seal in Massachusetts is a racist seal that's been perpetuated. Number 4, there is something called the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. In the Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda are 5 bills before the State House, none of which have gotten passed were talking about the one piece of Peru and how they're starting to organize into more than just one community, and they have more political power by doing that. I think of unions when there's a job action. Other unions come to their, their support, to their aid. Have the Wampanoag done anything like that in bringing together Mashpee and in some kind of a protest against this corridor or something like that, in which they can come together in a shared obvious interest in putting forward their own ties and needs to hold on to their own land, but with the Mashpee go to Aquina and help support the Aquina Wampanoag in that regard.
Well, that hasn't happened yet. I mean, this whole corridor thing is
We haven't
fairly
really done
new.
anything on it either.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly new. And there've been, listening sessions and meetings about it and that sort of thing, but, it's kind of just getting off the ground. And I don't know about the corridor, but I was just sitting here thinking, as we were talking, that more and more I'm seeing people, whatever type of event or situation is going on, I see people inviting, Mashpee, Aquina, and Herring Pond people or elders or whomever, to come together. So that's good.
And you go back through the history too, the Day of Mourning and some of these other things. And I think there's always been, solidarity with Aquina and Mashpee, but also other tribes. And I think it's an important part of it. And maybe in the same way that unions, it's like a, antidote to some of the structures of capitalism. It's like here, it's the structures of colonialism.
Hello, my name is Bahajani. I'm from the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. As a student, I feel like writing about Native stuff in general, including super sensitive topics relating to our culture, has always been kind of difficult for me. You did talk about it a little, trying to figure out how much to share and what to keep to yourself and things like that. So I was just curious about your approach to research and your methodology when writing this book in particular as compared to writing an article or a column. What were some challenges that you faced, if any, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, thanks. The process was just longer, and I think I took more time. When you're writing an article, I have these deadlines from an editor, and it's a shorter format. But also, I think you're able to get a quote in a phone call, right? Call someone up, talk for 10 minutes, get the quotes you need, and move on. For the book, it was important to me to spend more time with people and to not do interviews that was just a phone interview. Everybody I talked to in the book is I either went to them to do the interview, or it's somebody that I already knew, and then I could call them or Zoom or something. So that was important to me. And then also, a lot of these interviews, there are these small quotes in the book, but that's a quote from a 3-hour conversation. And in that conversation, I would, what do you want to talk about? What is your perspective? Do you understand what's going on? Did you have a...
Yeah, that kind of reminded me of something. But for a lot of Native people, I know that we kind of have this idea of reciprocity. So I just wanted to ask if you did incorporate that in your approach. Did you maybe give gifts or stories, or was there any type of component like that? Because I feel like that's something that I tried to do, but sometimes just have this default feeling of it being mandatory.
Yeah, I think, coming from journalism, this is a tension where the sort of traditional white dude journalist is you can't have a personal relationship in any way with the source, you can't give a gift, And like, I don't believe in that at all. Like, yeah, I'm bringing gifts. My feeling is that if I'm asking people to share their story, if they have questions about me, I have to answer. And I never want to make it a situation where like I'm forcing them to learn about me. But if they have a question about either where I'm coming from or just what the process is, I always make sure to take the time to do that. And I think in journalism specifically, that's a problem that, I mean, there's a lot of problems with people reporting on Native communities, but that particular issue is people go in and they don't explain what they're doing. Like, is this a radio interview? Is this on TV? Is this breaking news? Is this a feature that's gonna take you a year to write? And so sometimes when I meet people, they're like, I talked to this other journalist and I never heard back from them, or it wasn't what I thought it was gonna be. And so I think the more, whether it's journalism or more like essayistic or personal or whatever it is, I think the more we can do that, the better. And yeah, I tried to incorporate as much reciprocity as possible, and that looks different in different circumstances. If I'm showing up to somebody's community, they've invited me in, obviously that's sort of an extra step versus like just taking extra time on Zoom or whatever it might be. But yeah, that was a really big part of it. And I think the challenge is it just takes longer. I don't think it's harder, because I think the work is better and it's more rewarding that way. But logistically, the challenge is that it just takes longer. And there are a few people that it was like, I have, my notes, all these records of our conversations, and it's like conversation 1, 2 hours, conversation 2, 2.5 hours, and there's all this series. And, I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm really grateful for that time. But in terms of actually producing something, which is what you're asking about, I think it does take longer. And I'm happy to take that time, but it's also a reality that navigating the space of like writing a book or writing articles, there's probably going to be an editor who's like, why are you doing that, or why do you need to bring a gift? And I think it's just, that's part of the privilege and responsibility of doing the work, is you have to be able to explain that, I think, to both directions. Yeah.
Is there one more question? No, we want to make sure we have enough time for the book signing and selling. So, anyone else have a question?
You can also ask me
Would
out
you like
there.
a final word? You would like?
Buy Linda's book, and then buy mine.
Yeah. Sounds good.
All right, so thank
Yeah.
Turbo gear here.
So I'll say 85. Okay, how about that? Okay.
Well, thank you.
That sounds good.
Oh, thank you.